We're quite far behind, so it's time to get creative. What's up, guys? That guy with a no, I dropped it. Pencil here. In fact, I do have it on me. Keep it on me at all times. That's one fact. Here we are for me to review chapter 238, 239, 240, and 241 of Four Knights of the Apocalypse, which is known as the King of Resolve, for one, then the Blood of Atonement, for two, then the Pilgrims, for three, and then finally the Four Knights versus the Knights of the Holy Grail, for four. So, obviously, I'm way far behind, and because of that, I'm just going to do basically 4 my thoughts videos in one to cover my thoughts on all these different chapters, and then we'll be back to normal reviews for 242. I legit was gonna just wait for 242 to drop and like record essentially 4 hours, but admittedly not too much happens in the last 2 chapters. A lot of the discussion in this review will be based on really these first 2 chapters, so let's not waste more time. Let's start the first 15-minute time for chapter 238, the King of Resolve. So I like this chapter mainly for the Arthur interactions. Now, I will admit, I'm a little bit sad that he cleaned up. I actually did really like how disheveled he looked. It really fit the whole idea that he's disconnected, but I will give Nakaba Suzuki credit for committing to the bit on him being really gangly, right? Like, ultimately, Arthur is a shell of his former self, even though visibly, especially with the beard and stuff gone, he hasn't actually aged that much. He's mainly just lost weight. Ultimately, Kath consuming him didn't necessarily remove any of his immortality or anything like that, like initially thought happened, considering, you know, he looked a lot older when we saw him so many chapters ago now. Like, a hot minute ago is when we actually saw Arthur. But he actually does appear to genuinely be the same age, just that he's, you know, just not really himself anymore, with Kath actually devouring a majority of him, or not a majority of him, but a majority of his chaotic force. He is left in this lesser state. Now, one thing I will readily admit that I do like about this, I like the violent reaction of the Four Knights, right? Ultimately, Merlin's integration into the narrative is something I'm still like, but that aside, I do like how Arthur stimulates this reaction in all of them. And I also like, very specifically, and this will get followed better up on in chapter 239, is specifically how Lance is the first one to lunge and essentially try to annihilate Arthur, only for Lance in that same moment to be the one to stop Tristan and Percival from immediately slaying Arthur. Ultimately, Lance is simultaneously extremely angry at Arthur, but also the most rational one when it comes to dealing with him. And ultimately, we see that the Knights essentially get it hardline confirmed that what the Sins told them about the Arthur that they were fighting not being Arthur was true. So they essentially get the conclusion to that. Now, for Arthur's integration himself, I do like Arthur's characterization. Like I mentioned, ultimately, I would have preferred an outright evil Arthur. I've gone on whole tirades about this, made whole videos about it. But this Arthur, this pathetic, hollowed out king, is more interesting than I really thought he was going to be. I do like that ultimately, even with him still having the influence and the power that he does, you know, he still technically is the boss of Merlin. He still technically is the king of chaos. Ultimately, he is everything that he is. He's still lesser. Ultimately, Arthur finds himself powerless, and it's interesting to see the character like this. Obviously, a lot of Arthur's story in the original Seven Deadly Sins is him being relatively powerless. He shows up in season 1, is kind of effective, but ultimately isn't too important to the ongoing plot at the time. That's more so saved for Mel and the rest of the Sins. Then, of course, we have him needing Mel and the rest of the Sins' help in Camelot. He can't do anything to stop his kingdom from being destroyed. A lot of Arthur's story is him kind of not being in the story, right? Like, he's here, he's there, he's actively affecting the plot by his existence, you know, just existing. But outside of that, Arthur really does feel like a passerby even still. And admittedly, one of my major complaints about Arthur in the original narrative is that I didn't really care for him as a character because he didn't really do anything for a lack of power. But as much as I'm okay with lack of power archetypes, in original Seven Deadly Sins, I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of him kind of just, you know, being there to be there, because this is based on Arthurian legend, so like he has to be here because that's important, but outside of that, he didn't really feel like much. However, now that we are characterizing him in this way, not just, you know, a guy who's there and powerless because he's just a guy, he's now a guy who's here and powerless mainly because he was essentially kind of forced to make a series of decisions by his mentor, and now is the one paying for the greed and the mistakes and the gluttony of Merlin is fantastic. Admittedly, I do feel bad for the Four Knights who really don't have much context for Merlin and thusly can't really bear their rage appropriately at her. Obviously, I'm not necessarily expecting Gawain to get extremely mad at her mother. Like, yeah, shock horror. She's gonna forgive Merlin instantly. But I do actually feel bad for Arthur, who does get consistently blamed for everything, like he was the one who had any say in anything. For Kath's integration into the narrative, I've already gone over it again and again and again. I still don't... Outside of external narrative copium, I still don't think Nakaba has done the work to really make me care about Kath as a character. I will agree that he's better, and I agree that the external headcanon work that we've done about him being corrupted by chaos and Arthur by consuming the both of them and being in this weird in-between state where he's this manifestation of pure annihilation and also kind of a silly human guy now, it's interesting enough, and the characterization is there that I feel like we're not making too big of a leap there, but ultimately Kath himself is still to me as a character. But with that being the case, we do have Lancelot essentially fully locking in on this idea that it is Arthur's fault, and very specifically Lance is angry at the nature of the narrative essentially being these two's failures domino affecting. And hey, I'm glad it's being acknowledged. Now, do I think either character is going to suffer the punishment for this? I mean, they kind of already are, in the sense that Arthur is, once again, a powerless individual, simply relying on other heroes to do his work for him, and Merlin has isolated herself. Admittedly, she does seemingly have contact with the real world. Not even seemingly. We know she has contact with the real world through her golem, but she admits to Gawain that it's not really the same as actually being there to raise her. And also, she still needs to stay locked away from Kath. Then, of course, we have Arthur essentially making the choice to flip and stab himself directly in the chest. Now, obviously, when this first came out, I don't know what the initial reaction was. I didn't read it. I didn't read it because I was trying to wait to review it, but then the next chapter came out, and the next chapter came out, and the next chapter came out. But Arthur specifically removing himself from the narrative. Specifically, the line that gets me is this end line right here. You're right. Of course. I could apologize all day to you, and do nothing to atone for my people's pain or fulfill my duty. And we see he pulls out a knife, immediately flips it in his hand, and jabs himself. And this is where I feel like I'm always saying we're gonna let Nakaba cook, but I guess I'm gonna let Nakaba cook here, mainly because I'm assuming Four Knights is going to go on for longer than the original narrative. Obviously, this is chapter 238, and for reference, the manga of the original Seven Deadly Sins would be ending in about 100 and something chapters, like I think like 120, 130, but it does feel like we're still in a very weird middle point, and unfortunately, these chapters that I'm reviewing currently only extend that feeling for me, because Arthur still isn't doing anything, right? And while you could definitely argue that this is Nakaba going down the super subversive route of being like, hey, I'm gonna do our theory mythology, except we're not gonna focus too much on Arthur, except we're gonna focus a lot on Arthur, except that's not even gonna be really focusing on Arthur, it's gonna be focusing on the thing that Arthur released that was consumed by Arthur, which then consumed his own power, and then we're gonna have that be the main villain, and then we're not really gonna have Arthur do much of anything at all. That could be it, but I don't know. Just like in original Seven Deadly Sins, everybody and their mom was kind of like waiting and expecting Arthur to do something major. I'm assuming he's still going to end up eventually doing something major, especially with the introduction of the Knights of the Holy Grail, though obviously next chapter will go on to reveal that they don't even know why they're here, right? It could just be something that I'll go into theory-wise on why the Knights of the Holy Grail are here and what that could mean for the timeline and stuff like that, and how much, or I suppose like the scale that Seven Deadly Sins could be going to, or the duology could be going to, because obviously we're in Four Knights. But very specifically, I will say this in terms of everyone else's reactions to Arthur. It does sort of like linger and dance around this idea that I've kind of been worried about for a little bit, that I've been going back and forth on, and I've dropped like thoughts on it loosely, but I'll go into it further here. They don't really have a connection to the narrative as it stands now, right? Even with the reveal of Kath being fine, the very next chapter, I'm pretty sure, it doesn't really feel like our characters are invested in the same way that our characters were in the original narrative, right? Because ultimately, we don't really have an antagonist group at the moment. Our antagonist is Kath. We have the antagonist group that is Camelot, like the vague concept of Camelot, a bunch of nameless fodder knights, but the four evils aren't even the four evils anymore as far as we know. They have been completely liberated, completely removed, and as far as we know, every single one of their loved ones is now no longer in danger. I suppose the only ones would be like Worldane's lizard folk, but like that's it, and even then, who knows what she could do to get them out of there. So we don't have antagonists beyond Kath. And while obviously the next chapter will go on to reestablish Kath Paluk as the antagonist, with the essential cool interactions with Arthur being summed up to, we should all slaughter him right now. Oh wait, actually no, this isn't the guy we've been dealing with, and he's kind of just not been here in the narrative. We're still very disconnected on both the protagonist side and the antagonist side. Arthur, while a more interesting character now, I'll readily give that, he's not involved, right? He's not doing anything, so I'm not overly interested in Arthur, and obviously he's not really going to help too much outside of providing his blood, which we'll find out more about next chapter for the Holy Grail. And then, obviously, the other major issue we run into is that since we only have Kath as an antagonist, and our characters don't know Kath, we're kind of stuck. And the reason I say this is different from something like Seven Deadly Sins with the 10 Commandments and the 4 Archangels and the developments that were going on parallel here, right? Like, I believe around this time in the original narrative, thank you to the person who always leaves the comparative chapter in Seven Deadly Sins original to the current narrative of Four Knights, but I believe we just wrapped up post-resurrection Meliodas versus Escanor, and we were currently going down that arc for the Demon King. All that was still very, very involved, right? Even if we didn't fully understand the Demon King at that point, we knew the Demon King was the big bad. We had the Ten Commandments as a I don't want to call them mid-link, like a mid, but we had them as like a mid-section antagonist group that we could lock on to and focus on, that characters could establish dynamics with and build with. That's what we had King and Diane and Joel and Gloxinia for. Like, we had stuff that was built in and really well connecting the narrative for both antagonists and protagonists, and everything felt really, really balanced. But we are once again still struggling with the issue that we have sort of been played with ever since Kath was defeated. We do have an antagonist, but like, no one knows him. No one cares about him. There's no direct emotions and feelings. And you could argue, well, the direct emotions and feelings are still for Arthur, it's just for Carther, right? Lancelot still clearly hates him. Percival definitely still has his vendetta against him. And obviously, Tristan probably will feel a certain type of way if he finds out that his mother is sleeping. She'll be fine. But with that being the case, I don't know, man. It's still, I still want to say let Nakaba cook, but how long am I going to let him cook, man? We had, like, all the foundational setup that seemed to exist for longer term emotionally investing antagonists, for our main, guy, Arthur, to be doing something more than just standing around and providing juice to fuel the main narrative. Like, I don't know. And unfortunately, I'm gonna say it again, a lot of these problems could have been solved if Arthur was just the main antagonist, man. Like, don't get me wrong, this is an interesting enough idea in terms of Arthur being disconnected yet interconnected to the narrative, and the only key to taking down Kath being weapons made of his blood. But like, I don't know, man. It just doesn't really hit because of how vague everything is. And to be fair, vague storytelling is not inherently a bad thing, right? It's why I have been saying, even with us lacking antagonists, let Nakaba cook, he's gonna be fine, we're gonna make this work out. But especially since this is the Arthur moment, and notably, obviously I'm looking into the future as I'm reviewing chapter 238, very specifically, we leave him here. There's no further development for him here. We're not going to be following him or seeing him. He's not going to return to Leon. Like, no, he's just out of the narrative for now. We spent all this time building to him, to the King of Resolve, and all he can offer us is a blood sacrifice. And admittedly, that's a lot, but that's it. I don't know. It feels very... The word I'm looking for is non-committal, right? It almost feels like Nakaba doesn't really have a thing he wants to commit to. And sure, that does lead to some cool storytelling aspects, right? Like, I'm intrigued to see the reasoning for the Knights of the Grail being here, especially when in 239 it'll be established that Merlin and Arthur don't even know why they're here, right? Like, and why they're here, specifically in this sub-realm, reachable by these characters, right? Like, we have no idea. But, once again, it feels like we're building to something that isn't anything just yet. I don't know. It does, I'll admit this, it does give me very strong season 1 Demon King vibes, right? Where ultimately, if you look back at all, like, you go all the way back to season 1 of Seven Deadly Sins, you can see the build to the Demon King all the way from back there. So, once again, I hate to say this, maybe in 100 chapters or so, I'll see the vision on what Nakaba's building to. But unfortunately, right now, if we're just building back to Kath again, which next chapter seems to imply at least for a little bit, I don't know, man. It doesn't it doesn't really hit because Cat doesn't really serve well. He serves better, I'll say this, because many people have said it before, and while I used to argue and fight back a lot, I'm not going to argue and fight back anymore. Yeah, Cat is an infinitely more interesting antagonist than the Demon King and the Supreme Deity, right? Demon King and Supreme Deity were more interesting for, like, the foundational structures of the world and, like, what they created through their actions, rather than they themselves as individual characters. Meanwhile, Cath is just innately more interesting because of his weird warped personality and the many different interpretations you can have of him. But all that being said, it does leave chapter 238 as an interesting resolution and establishment of certain ideas. A good, I'm not gonna say it's a bad resolution, but a good resolution to the four knights actually meeting the real King Arthur, which we've been building to arguably since chapter 1, right? Like, before we even knew the real King Arthur, or like, I suppose chapter 23, when we found out Arthur was the main antagonist. To be fair, we knew Arthur was the main antagonist since chapter 1. So yeah, it's nice to finally see them meet. It's nice to see the conflict. It's nice to see the dynamics built. But ultimately, I feel like the story itself is still missing that little extra bit of sauce that would have my toes curling. Toes aren't exactly mad curled right now. And because of that, I'm still going to give the chapter a degree of worthiness for what it does to make Arthur a more interesting character and play with his powerlessness in a more interesting way. But outside of that, I feel like Merlin gets off scot-free. I feel like Arthur gets off scot-free. I feel like, not scot-free, I don't know. Their punishment is active by the nature of their existence, but it just doesn't necessarily hit because they're not really going to be involved in the narrative. But enough of chapter 238, let's move on to chapter 239, the Blood of Atonement. Now, this chapter is essentially for the establishment of two things, the Holy Grail and the lack of knowledge on the Grail Knights. So, Arthur impales himself, immediately produces a whole bunch of that drank, and then that drank floats in the air, and then proceeds to essentially leave Arthur in actual pretty bad straits. Once again, I don't know what it is with Nakaba being very half-committal on this immortality stuff. Like, brother, what do you mean? But regardless, we see Percy and Tristan immediately go in to heal Arthur, and Merlin, who initially seems at least a little bit shocked that he did that last chapter, immediately reacts to the blood pooling out, and then manifests a spell which makes the Holy Grail, infusing Arthur's blood into a cup, and essentially we get an excuse. I'm not going to say excuse. Excuses me. We get a reason for why the knights, one, weren't involved in the battle with Carther, whatever you want to call him, and two, currently in the narrative are lacking their sacred treasures. Now, I will admit, it definitely makes the Four Circular feel mad underwhelming because it wasn't even a weapon capable of doing anything. But on top of this, it does, like, it is a very mixed bag for me. I like this utilization of the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail, I don't even think is in, like, original Arthurian mythology. It's post-Christianization. It's like, it's a whole thing for its implementation to the narrative. And obviously with the Holy Knights, or the Grail Knights essentially introducing themselves as the Grail Knights, we knew there had to be some sort of lead into it. So it being characterized as Arthur's blood, and very specifically, a weapon infused with my blood will cancel out all chaos-driven protection and will enable you to fully kill Cath. This is very interesting because, like, that means we could possibly do it. And that does also reinforce the idea that the future that Guinevere saw, where Lance was standing over Bond's body, is still possible. If we go with the common theory that Bond will end up being possessed by Cath, and he'll end up in a younger form, and then he'll start fighting in this, that, and the third, right? Ultimately, that does lead to that, and it would explain why Lance would be standing over Bond's body after presumably slaying him with that spear that will go on to be crafted for him. A spirit spear? Who knows? But there is that. And with that being the case, we see that Arthur once again sort of talks about how this is all my own doing. I have no intention of clinging to life. Arthur, you need to be more interested in the character, bro. You need to be more involved in the plot. But with it being the case, we see, admittedly, this is where I'm going back and forth, right? Where part of me really wants to be like, what are we doing? But at the same time, I do like the dynamic that's clearly being established here between the knights and Arthur. Obviously, Lance just hates him, right? He hates him, and he does have, like, sour opinions towards Merlin. I feel like he directs a lot of hatred at Arthur, though. For understandable reasons, he's directed a lot of his hatred at the appearance of Arthur for a long time, so I get why he doesn't immediately redirect it all to Merlin. But even Tristan, very specifically, looking towards Arthur and sort of chastising him on how to be king is very interesting, especially with the implications that Isaye, Lysaye, whatever, his son from the future, doesn't even know him. So, like, Tristan may literally end up dead. But that aside, it is interesting to see how Tristan's morals and ideologies are being pushed onto Arthur because of how he was raised as an individual. And seeing the contrast dynamic between these two is very, very nice. Two bright young lads with a whole bunch of chaotic potential. Really, really nice. And then, of course, we get Percy's dynamic with Arthur. Now, I'll say this. Percy's dynamic with Arthur in particular kind of... it goes exactly how I think it would, right? Ultimately, it does reestablish that Arthur was at least conscious for the existence of Varghese and Camelot. That was like a real thing. That wasn't just all Cath. And because of that, we see Percy essentially get to have a resolution to his feelings about Varghese, and very specifically how he felt towards him, which is something that Percy never necessarily got from Cath because they never really interacted. I'll say that one time when he smacked him away. But then, of course, we see Merlin and Gawain. Now, once again, I understand that we don't really get to have too much time with these two, so I'll definitely cherish this conversation right here. In fact, this is one of the few things I'll actually fully voice. It moves me just as much seeing you for the first time in 18 years. Don't be so hyperbolic, Mom. You were there for me this whole time. No, I mean it. Seeing you with my own eyes is so different than through the eyes of a golem. You truly have grown, haven't you? Would you mind giving your mother a better look at your face? Oh, but if I show it to only you, Mom, I know that Dad will be all pouty about it later, so... Gawain? And she turns, Merlin smiling, tackles Mom. Now, I'll admit, my opinion on Merlin as a character has, like, flip-flopped. I still feel... I realize I did not start the 50-minute time for this chapter. Whoops, but I have an idea of how long 50 minutes should be. But essentially, I have thoughts on Merlin, on how she's used as a narrative device first. And I think for the longest time, I was exclusively looking at her as the plot device that she is, right? And to be fair, I say this all the time, every single character is a plot device. Every single character is a narrative tool. Every single character is a piece of a narrative, and by proxy, they all fit those means and molds and metrics. But notably, in my opinion, and this is definitely a my opinion thing, I'm not educated in literature or anything like that, so correct me if I'm wrong for any of my actual literature people down there. I know you all exist. I think one of the things you should be able to do as a writer is gaslight your audience so they don't realize what or how much of a plot device a certain character is. Merlin is like Deus Ex Machina, the character, the thing, everything. Like, that's what she is. And I didn't like that. But, very specifically, the reading the comments and talking with friends and going through it, I like Merlin a lot more, even if I can still see she's purely existing to get the plot moving forward in certain directions, right? Like, that's where my brain is like, okay, I'm letting it slide. And Merlin being a complex character, right? As much as I don't like that her whole motivation, the entire sequel series only exists because of unrequited love, I still really don't like that. Very specifically, the lengths that she was willing to go to satiate her own curiosity, her own gluttony, for the very idea that she was not given the one thing that she wanted is very human, right? And of course, I glaze characters like Kenjaku all the time. But I think the main difference between like a Kenjaku and a Merlin, and why it's taken so long for me to basically come around to Merlin in comparison to Kenjaku, is Kenjaku's character is just evil, right? Right? Like, Kenjaku's just evil. Like, he's just a monster, an animal, a creature. Merlin is explicitly pushed through the narrative as like a good person, or if not a good person, like a protagonist, right? Kenjaku's never characterized as a protagonist. He's characterized as an evil guy. So I don't worry about it too much. Meanwhile, Merlin is characterized as someone we're supposed to like root for, feel positive about. But I think it is that character complexity where good people who do good things can do bad things for the sake of themselves is still very, one, true to life and very human. And two, I can't, as much as I don't like how plot device heavy she is, looking at it this way, if she wasn't so plot device heavy, some of my favorite moments in the narrative and the entire sequel series literally wouldn't happen. Arthur wouldn't be at all an interesting character without Merlin, unfortunately. So, like, yeah, I'm gonna have to come around to her. Where she ranks personally for me amongst the sins, she's definitely not the least favorite anymore. She's probably somewhere in the middle for me. Ultimately, I've come to respect Merlin a lot more as a character, and while I still think a lot of her narrative integration is like a little bit sloppy, it's fine. I've come to appreciate her a whole lot more. This chapter helps with it, and very specifically seeing her dynamic with Gawain. Now, of course, it's not like the whole. There's still many parts of Merlin's character that I think are not written or handled very well. But that aside, with it being the case, we do get to see that ultimately we see that the nature of the knights as saviors, very specifically Percy and Tristan, directly contrasting with their natures as death and pestilence, is very intriguing. I do think Nakaba, speaking of things Nakaba's building to, I do think Nakaba is building to some sort of hard contrast with these two. Obviously, we do have, like, death mode Percy, we do have, like, demonic Tristan. We have instances of both of these characters going full dark, full devious mode, but I think one thing we have yet to see in comparison to something we have seen Lance do, and to be fair, we need to see Gawain do it as well, but she's more so focused on, like, the Merlin dynamic and aspect of that all. That's her mom. This is in the third. This chapter really highlights the idea of these two as saviors, as healers, as supporters, right? So I'm very interested to see how Nakaba is going to play with the idea that, you know, this is the Night of Death, and this is the Night of Pestilence. Obviously, you could argue a lot of it's just propaganda, but they are seemingly described as this. They are still known as the Four Knights of the Apocalypse. The apocalypse brought on by chaos? Sure, but still, I'm interested to see how they're going to be characterized as that. Especially since, obviously, both have already shown the ways they can reach those points, considering how much Arthur, you know, the positive, good, positive, good, bright, light side of the narrative is glazing them. I'm interested to see when that darkness comes out of both. But with it being the case, we see that ultimately Arthur does commit. Will we see it? Hopefully. Arthur does commit, but you didn't. You saved someone like me. Thank you. I intend to do whatever I am I can't read. I intend to do whatever I am still capable of. And we see Percy go, sure. And Tristan go, please do. As Merlin looks on, seemingly a bit forlorn, while Gawain looks on, just cheesing. And we see Lance once again reaffirm this negativity to Arthur, right? Very simply saying, well, I didn't come here to rescue you. And I ain't about to forgive you either. And, hey, I'll take it. I still think Arthur the victim is something that I don't think Nakaba was going to fully play with. But if anything, I'm fine with one of the knights still having negative opinions towards him, and specifically being the knight who has so many direct ties to Camelot and Arthur as an antagonist, from the whole Jericho thing to what happened to his father, which he doesn't even really fully know about yet. Like, there's so many things that Lance has to continue being an interesting and engaging character with that side of the narrative. I'm glad he's there at least. Do wish one of the other knights was still more on that timing too, but still, it's fine that at least Lance is at the moment. But with it being the case, we see Arthur literally accept this, which I actually do really, really like. But the other thing I do see is this specific. Oh, well, actually, no. Does it not have in this chapter? I might see. This is what happens when you read the chapters all once and then immediately go to review them. But with it being the case, we cut back to Leonis, and we see that ultimately Meliodas and the rest are not seeing the people of Galliard off, as Lance thought of Gawain, and then Guinevere, and then we immediately cut back to Guinevere and Leonis and the people. Obviously not going to have time to go to this chapter, but this, that, and the third, we come back to see that Kath is back. Obviously, it makes sense. He's infused with chaos. Sevendeadlysins didn't know that. Unfortunately, they did. Like once again, I'm not gonna go too deep into it because I complained about it so much already. But realistically, the plan to attack Kath didn't make any sense. Or even when they thought it was Arthur, it didn't make sense to do it at that time. When Merlin specifically told them that they didn't have the keys to do it, they would need to come find her first. Why did they do it? So stupid. But that aside, Kath is back. Like I said, I don't know. I'm gonna allow Nakaba to cook with Kath. Let's put it that way. I'm gonna allow him to cook with Kath. Because at the moment, I still don't really care for the character, right? But in that, this once again may be a Merlin thing where I may just be biased against the character for the role they play, and it not being like I'm not sure 100% if I'm judging Kath objectively based on this narrative integration, or if I'm still mad that Arthur just was the main antagonist, right? There's still I had Arthur as the main antagonist set in my mind for literal years, literally like pre-Four Knights even release years. So yeah, I think I may just be biased against Kath. I do like the horror aspect of his return too, very specifically the idea that he's sneaking along with his quote-unquote bride, which sees the future, the idea that one way or another he's going to ride with them back to them or back to their kingdom in order to rebuild his strength, maybe consume and take them over in the real world, and then who knows from there go on to manipulate and then strike back at the Sins again while they don't have their perfect time. They don't have their immortality. Like, it can be interesting, right? It can be interesting. Do I think Kath is the final boss? No? I don't know. It feels like I don't know if I'm reading this wrong. It doesn't feel like Kath is the main antagonist in the future. where our Knights of the Grail come from, but also the Knights of the Grail have strong implications of like Tristan being dead. But at the same time, it has Glaze implications, like Anne is Vice Captain Holy Knight. I don't know, it's very weird. It's very weird. I still feel very weird about Cath. I'm gonna have to just think. A scary thing, I know. Thought happening up here, horrifying. But I'm gonna have to sit down and think a lot about Cath and like how much I like or dislike the character, because he's not bad. Like, oh, I'm trying to think what are the reasons I don't like Cath. I think it's literally just because I don't like that he's not Arthur. Because what he's done for the characters that he has interacted with, what he did for Lancelot as a character, what he's done for Arthur as a character, putting him back in his victim position, what he's done for Merlin as a character to put her in this position of fear where she needs to protect and hide Arthur, for what ultimately he did to Meliodas and Tristan. Yeah, I think I may literally you're literally seeing the hamster wheel run by Ed right now, just going through and being like, yeah, I think I am more positive leaning towards Cath than I am negative leaning at this point. He's good for what he is. Do I think he could have been something more interesting? Yeah, but once again, that wasn't the story Nakba decided to tell. And a big thing I'm trying to do for myself is rationalize around the stories that the author wants to tell, rather than the story that I think would have been more interesting. If I want to write my own story, I have fanfic, and I'm literally writing my own story. So that aside, I'm gonna give this chapter another case of worthiness. Establishing the Holy Grail, establishing Cath's return, the hope of Cath, or the hope of actually defeating Cath, and Cath's actual return being in the same chapter. Genius writing move, the dynamics being established between Arthur and the Knights. Good. Once again, especially if Cath isn't actually the final antagonist, and not in like the same way that the Demon King wasn't actually the final antagonist. I don't think we're gonna get like a 30 chapter follow up and then boom, that's it, the series ends. Anyway, I'm assuming there's going to be a whole like new section of narrative after Cath. So in that case, I am very excited to see how that is going to resolve, and that is set up very, very well here. So I believe my 15 minutes is up, so let me start the 15-minute timer for the next chapter, 240. There we go, actually remember to start this time. The Pilgrims. Now, obviously, this chapter establishes Lance still being very, very mad, as he literally just aura farms through the entire building and leaves these two behind, going all the way down to the base of their structure. And we see that ultimately Merlin and Arthur do actually generally come to see them off. And we see that Tristan says, "We're off, my lady. Let's all join hands to end the fight against Camelot." The fight against Cath. But Camelot, I guess, in a general sense, like the fight against Cath. Like, brother, y'all know the truth at this point. What's happening? But with it being the case, we see Arthur and Merlin smiling and seeing them off. And we see that the Knights, this is what I thought happened all the way back in chapter 230. I should have read the chapter multiple times before I actually start reviewing. But essentially, we see that ultimately, Gawain asked a very important question, right? This Holy Grail you gave us, why is it named that? Merlin explains, well, would any other vessel be worthy of the name Holy Grail? It holds the blood of the noble king who rules over chaos that births all creation. I'm betting the upscale will go crazy from that. Births all creation? All creation? What do you mean by that? But with it being the case, we see that now they actually ask about the Knights of the Holy Grail. Now, of course, this is very interesting. Like, obviously the Grail is just a spell Merlin manifested to hold Arthur's blood. But, like, does that imply in the future that one, like, essentially my main question brought up by this divergence, specifically Arthur not knowing a group like that, no one having any context for them, is intriguing. It could legit be Fire Emblem Awakening. And you may be like, Pencil, you keep referencing this thing. What happened in Fire Emblem Awakening? It has been a while, right? I think the game came out, 13 years ago? But essentially, in Fire Emblem Awakening, spoilers for Fire Emblem Awakening, it's been 13 years. Lucina's in Smash, right? You'll know the deal. But essentially, in Fire Emblem Awakening, there is a split timeline, right? Ultimately, it is very much implied that it works like Dragon Ball time travel logic, where there is a spell that in the future is used by, I believe, Naga? I forget which dragon god it is, but essentially there's a portal open to the past. The kids from the future go back into the past based on bonds made in the current time of the game. However, it is very important to note that once the kids come back to the present time, the timeline splits. It's not never clearly laid out, but it's implied that the kids can't go back to their own time, right? For one. And for two, they don't accidentally bootstrap / grandfather paradox themselves by coming back to the past and interacting with their parents. They are still guaranteed to exist. But and they don't accidentally erase themselves. And that's what I'm thinking happens here. With the Holy Grail still existing in the future and not, seemingly entirely being used up, that may mean that they found another way to defeat Kath in the future, or I guess the cup is just being protected by them, meaning more of Arthur's blood may have been put into it, or not all the blood ends up getting used to forge the actual weapons of the four knights, who we do know at least some of are still alive in the future based on how the Knights of the Grail talk about them. But with that being the case, we see that Merlin once again lays the groundwork for a narrative beyond Kath, which I do appreciate. Like I said, as much as I have literally, I'm not gonna say gaslight myself, I just thought about it. I've thought about it, and I like Kath now. I like him more than I did. But with it being the case, one of the lines here that sort of once again sets up the idea that there's probably gonna be a threat greater than what we actively see in the narrative, very akin to how I say Kath, sticking with the Fire Emblem Awakening references, Kath is much more a, what's the guy's name? Evil King of Plegia. Gangrel. Kath is much more a Gangrel than he is a Grima, if that makes any sense. Kath is much more a Ten Commandments than he is the Demon King, if that makes sense. Where ultimately Merlin says something here. As Arthur says, the Four Knights of the Apocalypse, taking on the will of the legendary band of seven. So kind and steady and brave. A group blessed with boundless possibilities, no doubt. And we see that Merlin says, that one in particular seems precarious to me. And Arthur naturally asks, precarious? And now, of course, this could be a translation thing, this could be me reading it wrong, but that one in particular, I'm assuming she's referring to Lance just because of how he stormed out, and obviously we do know that future vision of Gawain, or not Gawain, of Guinevere, where she sees Lance having struck down Bon. But it could literally be the concept of the Four Knights themselves. That's what it feels like to me. And it comes with the idea that the Four Knights do have their titles: the Knight of War, the Knight of Death, the Knight of Famine, the Knight of Pestilence. I feel like there is definitely something that's going to happen to our group that is going to change their contextualization. And I do think their kids are likely going to have some sort of involvement with that. But with that being the case, we see that Merlin doesn't dwell on it for now. Once again, sort of like setting up the idea in my head that there's going to be something beyond Kath. As she switches topic when she says precarious, even as Arthur asks, what do you mean by precarious? She goes, no, I'm overthinking it. For now, we must keep a careful eye on Kath's moves, which I don't think they can. Like, I don't know how they're tracking Kath. But with that being the case, Merlin confirms, even if he takes the defeat at the hands of the seven deadly sins, his evil has far from perished. And this obviously raises the question of, why are the kids here? Right? Like, do I have time? Yeah, I definitely have time. Why are the kids here? It doesn't seem like they come from a necessarily bad future, right? In fact, I'll talk more about wondering why the kids are here and like the split timeline of it all, and like how Fire Emblem Awakening is this Fire Emblem Awakening remake. But with it being the case, we see that ultimately Lance is mainly mad, halfway due to a mix of probably the Jericho stuff, and also halfway due to the feelings that Guinevere has instilled in him, right? Ultimately, we get a very cute scene of Tristan acknowledging everything he knows about Lancelot. Like, these two are basically brothers from different mothers, which, oh, McFargo, take that. But with that aside, we do see that as Lance is about to get his favorite toy spoiled, we see that Lance has fully fallen for Guinevere. I will admit, said it before, I'll say it again, romance is not knock of a strong suit. These people have met like thrice. What? He had a vision of her. They met again. He had a vision of her in those mountains. They met for the first time and spent a bit of time together on that day. Guinevere said they'd fall in love. Then Guinevere straight up dips out and abandons him. Doesn't even risk changing the timeline there. Then he doesn't meet her for years afterwards. They meet up a third time, and then that's just the woman that Lance loves. Personally, I'll give I'll give Percy and Anne and Nasians this. Yeah, I believe that. There was enough time spent on the developing friendship and the romance dynamic between those three that, yeah, I can see how that works out. Tristan and Isolde, well, we don't actually get that much time with either of those two. I can also see the vision on that. Gawain is alone. Like, seemingly canonically alone. Like, I don't think she ever gets with anybody, not even Bala. Which, hey, I'm fine with. First she got with a woman, but hey, would it be like, it'd be like that sometimes. In fact, who knows? That may be the implication that she did get with a woman in the future. But to be fair, it's a magical universe, right? There's gotta be some way for two women to have kids. But all that aside, very specifically, Lance and Guinevere, I'm still not the biggest fan of Guinevere. As much as I've been able to reverse rationalize and gaslight myself about Merlin, as much as I've been able to just in this very moment re-rationalize and think about my opinions on Kath, I just don't care for Guinevere. And notably, I will say this, unlike Arthur and unlike Merlin, this is actually probably due to the inverse problem of Guinevere sort of being underexposed as a character in terms of like her narrative utilization. She's there so Lance has a romantic interest. And that's kind of it. And I guess she's also there to get Jade killed, which is like meant to support our character's development, which it admittedly does. It does fantastic stuff for Tristan and stuff like that. But like, outside of that, I don't know. Guinevere hasn't done much. I don't really care for the character. Like, it's just, and once again, there's no reason for her to be that much younger than our main cast and crew. No reason for her to be 4 years. It's just weird. I don't know. She's just a weird character. I get it. Guinevere is a very, very, very important part of Arthurian legend. I'm not saying Nakaba should have removed her from the narrative. And admittedly, I do like once again, it's more so I understand and like the results of the destination, but the journey to get to the destination just doesn't necessarily hit for me, because seeing Lance essentially deny his sudden outburst about actually being in love with somebody is hilarious, right? And him dodging the questions and not worrying about it. All that's really, really funny, really, really cute, really, really sweet. I just don't care for Guinevere. Will that change? I don't know. I like, especially with this chapter coming along and revealing that, you know, Guinevere and her people are heading back to their kingdom and stuff like that, but you know, they're bringing Kath along, this, that, and the third. I don't know. That will once again have to be an exposure thing. But with it being the case, we do see that they are still in the land of Camelot, in the land chaotic Camelot. They still are in the land of chaos, and naturally, we see they are immediately reassailed by the Knights of the Grail. They all come in and continue to recommit back to their attack. Now, now, how much time do I have left? I have 5 minutes left. Okay, because next chapter will be more like serious characterization for everybody, I will go into it here, how I think the kids are here, how they got here, or something along those lines. Now, like I said, I do think this is heavily operating on some Fire Emblem Awakening logic. I mean, there's two paths. I've already went over the Fire Emblem Awakening logic, where it's a split timeline. They came from not necessarily like a fallen or failed timeline in the same way as bad as the Fire Emblem Awakening future timeline is, but at least something went wrong in the future that brought these guys to the past. However, the thing is, they don't seem to know they're in the past. That is a fundamental difference from the Fire Emblem Awakening kids. They knew they were time traveling to the past. They all ended up in very weird scenarios outside of like Lucina herself, who like intentionally went and like interfered with the main plot. She's like the only real canon kid. And be like, what about Morgan? What about Morgan? I said canon kid for all the Fire Emblem fans. Sorry, going down a different rabbit hole. This is like a Kingdom Hearts thing. But very specifically, it does seem like they don't know they're from the future. And it doesn't seem like they recognize their parents in their younger forms. Now, admittedly, I don't think I'd recognize their parents either. Like, admittedly, they haven't aged much at all, but I think if I were to be spontaneously thrown into the past and not know I was in the past, I wouldn't spontaneously assume these people who look like and possibly even sound like my parents are literally my parents. And they're like, oh, that's oddly coincidental. But there is that. Then, for why they could be here, there's the awakening incident where they came back intentionally, right? But there's like a pseudo awakening version of this where they didn't come back intentionally, but because of how chaos works, and very specifically that a majority of chaos underwent like weird circumstances thanks to the battle against the Seven-deadly-sins and the nature of Camelot itself spontaneously changing and evolving and moving in constant flux because of how it was constructed and the inconsistency natural to chaos. And very specifically, especially with the font of all creation line, right, that Merlin gives here for the naming of the Holy Grail, it holds the blood of the noble king who rules over the chaos that births all creation. Now, obviously there's just the upscale behind this line, but all creation also rings out as something intriguing, because all creation isn't just all of space, it's all of time. And obviously, we saw in the battle with the Seven-deadly-sins that Kath did have admittedly, now I thought about it, a long theorized power of chaos. Hey, if chaos has such fundamental control over reality and can create these separate spaces that have different time flows in them, well, then clearly it has control over time, right? But as a byproduct of that, it's possible that the realm of Camelot sort of like data sampled those who invaded it, aka the four knights, and then drag their kids back through time as if they were meant to be here. Essentially, I'm saying the kids could be here by accident, not intentionality, like in Fire Emblem Awakening, where they did end up being thrown into the past, but mainly because the nature of Camelot as a realm is very strange in terms of how time interacts. So they've just been pulled back to this moment unintentionally. Did this erase their future timeline? Questionable. I don't know. We do know that the multiverse, at least in terms of Seven Deadly Sins, larger canon is canon. like the Seven Deadly Sins multiverse is a thing. It's never necessarily been acknowledged in the main duology, though. It's like notorious in the video games and in like Grand Cross, and I believe what is it called? The Seven Deadly Sins game that like I think recently came out or is just about to come out. That like whatever. It's the game that Tristan and King's daughter, whatever her name is, that they're the main characters of, right? Like that also deals in multiverse stuff, and there's statements about chaos being like a multiversal entity from there. But I'm saying all that to be saying, if they were brought here accidentally from the future, because of the weird state of flux that Camelot's in due to the battle with the Seven Deadly Sins and the interflow of time, and very specifically how the four knights are interacting with Camelot and like their great powers and great relevance to the realm, causing that weird time break to bring their kids back. Maybe their original timeline is still out there. Maybe it's less Fire Emblem Awakening and more so Dragon Ball time travel. Maybe like, what's the difference, Pencil Man? And the difference is, one, in Dragon Ball, you can time travel to the separate timelines that are created. Timeline branches just create new time rings, which you can go to, this, that, and the third. And also, even when you leave a timeline, go back into the past, you do just create a new timeline, but you can always return to the initial future timeline that you came from. You won't jump forward in the timeline, the new timeline you created when you time travel into the future. You'll time travel essentially back to the future of the timeline that you came from. And that may be the case for the... almost called them the Knights. I called them something. But, I am out of time. But I will say this is another W chapter. Another W chapter, I will say. I do like the Lance characterization. I do like the mystery of the Grail Knights being played up even more. I do like Merlin's sort of, like, ominous setup for the future. And overall, it's just a good chapter. I like it a lot. And obviously, resetting up the idea of the four knights battling the Knights of the Grail again is really, really neat. Even though, as we'll see in the next chapter, the Knights of the Grail are kind of some bums. But with it being the case, hopping into chapter 241, let me start the 15-minute timer. Oh, it already has started. Alright, so let me go. The four knights versus the Knights of the Holy Grail, huh? I guess you call it the four knights versus the Knights of the Holy Bums, because they are trapped! But with it being the case, let me actually explain. We get a nice cool fight between father and son, aka Galahad and Lance. I do love the posing and the dynamism? English? I do love the dynamism here in this fight, seeing Lance specifically going tit for tat with his son here and explaining essentially, or not necessarily explaining, questioning how they exist, right? Who do you all belong to? You're not the Holy Knights of Camelot. And it's very specifically them responding being like, no, we definitely are. It does raise questions once again, like how their timeline works. Obviously the four knights have already been explained to be destined to serve under Arthur, but like the real King Arthur. But then once again, why are you here? If you came from what seems to be a relatively stable timeline and you believe you're still within that timeline and you're currently fighting fakes, like, wait, what happened? Where are your parents? But with it being the case, we see that ultimately to both sides, I've kind of like, if anything, while the Knights of the Grail may more so be in denial, it feels like the current Knights, our four Knights, aren't necessarily in denial, but I think they're just like not exactly sure what they think may be happening is happening. Lance doesn't seem to directly acknowledge that, hey, this could actually probably be my kid, because he doesn't think of it that way. But we will literally see Percy later on this very chapter going to be like, wait a second, that's not my girl. Shoot, you like my girl. What you doing? But with it being the case, we see that ultimately the four Knights of the Apocalypse in their future that they come from are the heroes of Camelot. And considering that the Grail Knights haven't had like many negative reactions to Camelot as it is right now, it seems like they are like the Camelot that Arthur creates or created didn't get destroyed in the future when Kath was slain. It seems like he just got re-dominion over it all. But with it being the case, we see that ultimately both father and son are very stubborn and don't actually reach any sort of conclusion and keep on fighting. Though Lance does very, very well being a being without a weapon right now, going up against what presumably is at least a weapon of some kind that's capable of actually handling Galahad's strength, which he clearly did inherit from his father. But with it being the case, we get to see Percy going up against both of his children, as I completely forget her name. And I'm not going to look it up. I'm already down to 11 minutes. But with it being the case, we see Percy essentially a couple things get confirmed. One, the Force Circular will end up just being reforged. Percy will not get a new weapon, or the reforging won't change it all too much, as his daughter does confirm. You annoy me to no end, even using a replica of his own sword. And you can see through my own strikes. We see Percy is casually able to bob and weave and redirect all of these strikes, because these are Anne's fighting patterns, which he has known very, very well. And we see that Percy even literally just says, time out, confusing his opponent and causing her to collapse, very much like her mother, ironically enough. And we see that ultimately his daughter does answer that her teacher is Anne Galahad, vice captain of the Holy Knights, confirming that Anne does become vice captain. But if we're to assume that the Knights don't serve Leonis, according to Galahad, she's the vice captain of the Holy Knights of Camelot, which does make me wonder who the actual captain is. And we see that Percy is seemingly very, very confused about, like, this whole thing, as this doesn't line up with his timeline. And like I said, this does feel like he's sort of acknowledging, hey, is this? No. But wait. Huh. But of course, it is established that Percy didn't actually get to see the life spirits that would end up inhabiting his daughter and son, I do believe. He didn't actually get to see them very specifically. He said there will probably be new life spirits in them soon. So last time he saw Anne and Nossians, while he knew they were likely pregnant, he didn't actually get to recognize the life spirits, which explains why he doesn't automatically recognize his kids, even in the future. But with it being the case, we see that Percy does block the sheathed sword, but the Thunder God's sword staff is capable of electrocuting Percy, but it doesn't really do all too much. And then there's Carr. That's the son's name. I completely forget. I completely forget the daughter's name, though. And I didn't remember Carr's name until I literally just read it. But with it being the case, we see that the bow of the sacred tree gets used. Interestingly, it's the bow of the sacred tree. We do know that they did inherit their mother's necklace. We saw that design a few chapters back, where they had the piece of Chastieful that was gifted to Nossians, implying that Nossians may have actually gone on and gotten their own proper spirit spear, and essentially passed down their grandfather's spear, or their father's spirit spear, down to their kid as sort of a training weapon, as the bow of the sacred tree gets sent out and then splits into an increased version, and then immediately casts Blackthorn Winter, which is a very interesting spell that turns Percy into a tree. He'll be fine, but it does turn Percy into a tree. And we see that Tristan is worried about Percival, only to be assailed by his own child, Isaye. Now, admittedly, Isaye's relation to the timeline and Tristan's general integration in the timeline is very, very strange. Tristan is very long-lived. In fact, I literally saw a Reddit post recently pointing out that Tristan, of our four knights, is the only one to have not changed at all. Like, much at all from the pre-time skip. And a lot of people pointed out, though, that's presumably because he's super immortal, right? He's presumably only about 1/4 human, and he's half royal demon. And we know royal demons can live for a bare minimum of 6,000 years organically. We know that realistically, being the son of the gods directly, he should have something more along the lifespan of literal eternity, as the Demon King was over 1 billion years old thanks to all the time they spent in purgatory. But all that aside, Percy or Tristan not aging should mean that he should be well around and involved in his son's life, but Isaye doesn't seem to speak with Tristan of like an actual knowledge of who his father was, speaks of him very vaguely. But we do get to see that he does assail his father with thrust anger, only to be hit with falling star, which he does admittedly face tank. Doesn't like tank too well. His armor gets destroyed and he starts bleeding, but ultimately the the wings that pop out of his back do get to I thought they turned black. They do not. He just activates Black Awake. It's interesting that his demonic blood seemingly has taken lower precedent over his goddess blood, and he sort of actually has a design that doesn't necessarily reflect what I thought a hybrid Nephilim design would be. Like, his demon blood is, one, suppressed, and two, the mark that manifests on his head is white. And to be fair, I thought, and notably you can even go back to some of my older designs for like a full power Nephilim Tristan, I always thought the triskelion in Tristan's eyes would become black, and then the mark on his forehead would become white, or at least the center of it would become white. And it seems like Isaiah does seemingly have something akin to that with Black Awake. He does not have triskelion eyes, but he does have a white mark on his forehead. Notably, it doesn't look like any of his ancestors, though. It doesn't mirror Zeldris or Meliodas' mark. It doesn't mirror the Demon King's mark. And we know Tristan's demon mark does actually mirror his grandfather, the Demon King. But within the case, he flies up and then pierces Tristan, breaking through the Percival sword. Again, poor Percival sword, man. But to be fair, we do know they are going to be getting new weapons. So for the Percival sword breaking is actually generally fine. And Tristan gets seemingly run through, defeated, just like Percival is defeated. Or Tristan gets run through, defeated, just like Percival is defeated. Oh no! I feel so bad and so worried for them. Though admittedly, these proportions on Isaiah are crazy, bro. Like, brother, dude, quit skipping leg day, man. Like, look at this. But that aside, we do get to see woman whose name I forget, and Gawain go band for band in terms of spells, and ultimately, we learn that the Broad Smile Mask works with her mind to let her have the chanting time for 20 minutes per day. Super specific. Might as well be a JoJo's power. But with it being the case, Gawain is outclassed very specifically because her casting speed isn't as narrowed down as her mother's just yet, though it is heavily implied that Gawain in the future will essentially have this ability, and she may even be implied to be the one to have created this mask in the first place. So when she goes to pummel her daughter from the future with her physical power, she immediately does fail, gets frozen, and gets hit with Judgment of Death, seemingly dying. She'll be fine. We see Gawain is taken out. We see Percy's taken out. We see Tristan's taken out. Tristan is like, I'll give Gawain this. Gawain literally disappears. She probably teleported it out. We see that Percy is strung up. Percy's literally fine. He's basically immortal. And Tristan is on the end of the spear, but you note that the spear doesn't even pierce Tristan's back. He's fine. It's all right. They're chill. And we see that ultimately, I forget Gawain's daughter's name, says, and now the Holy Grail is back with us. And we see that ultimately all who remain standing is Galahad and Lancelot. Lancelot stays standing with the four knights, but we see that Galahad is commanded to hurry up and finish Lance off, but Lance has his hands in his pockets. He's looking around. He seems chill. He's like, everything's fine. And everything is presumably fine. None of the knights actually took any lethal damage. Well, Gawain has flat disappeared. We know she can teleport. Percy will literally be fine. He, should have, weird interactions with Blackthorn Winter and just, plants in general, thanks to being on Life Spirit, being able to absorb their life. And also, he's survived worse. It's Percy. He'll be fine. He's also our main character. So it doesn't feel like that all that often recently. And then Tristan literally doesn't even get pierced through. They're all fine. Lance is just going to get giga-ganked, but it'll be perfectly fine. Overall, I will say this. It's a good chapter. I'm interested, especially with the knights themselves still obviously being far from their peak potential. I'm talking Tristan and Percy and Gawain in particular in terms of being far from their potential. It is interesting to see sort of reflections of what their potentials could be in the future. Obviously, unfortunately, poor Anne daughter doesn't necessarily get much, but at least Carr has really interesting abilities based on the Sacred Tree, based on their great grandfather. Sacred Tree's been characterized as male. I think grandfather works. So there is that. It is interesting to see how they all seemingly hold back on their kids a little bit. I wonder if this is some subconscious stuff. You could just obviously be a writing thing where this is meant to be the Knights of the Grail's chance to show off, not necessarily a chance for the Knights to show off, as the Knights have shown off a bunch in the past. So seeing them work together, seeing them utilize their powers like this is interesting to see. And obviously the mystery of the Knights of the Grail specifically, is still the most intriguing part here. How are they here? Why are they here? How do they notice certain things, right? I can personally give a pass to Tristan and Lance and Percy and Gawain for not necessarily recognizing the magical signature of their kids, because obviously it just would be different from their own magical signatures. And two, they don't know them yet. They don't exist yet. So obviously they don't recognize the magical signatures of their kids. It is very interesting, though, that while we do know for a fact that Seven Deadly Sins is very akin to a lot of other power system-based universes where you can recognize a person's power in the power system, it's interesting that none of them actually note that these fakers, quote-unquote, feel like their parents. Even though Gawain's magical powers shouldn't have felt Like, it shouldn't have changed. The feeling provided by it shouldn't have changed. Lance's power especially shouldn't have changed unless he lost the Lady of the Lake sometime in the future. Tristan's power shouldn't have changed. And obviously Percy's power definitely shouldn't have changed. Both of those characters, Tristan and Percy especially, should be timeless in many ways. So thusly, they shouldn't really be in any position to not be recognized by their kids. So it's very interesting. And obviously I do wonder, what are they going to do with the Holy Grail? Right, like, obviously, I don't think the Knights of the Grail are actually going to end up keeping it. Lance is either about to viciously solo stomp all of them by actually, flaring his aura a little bit, and might be just holding back a little bit less. But on top of that, like, the Knights are presumably just going to get back up and handle their kids, and then they're going to get a whole explanation of this. But I do wonder what they think they're going to do with the Holy Grail. I do wonder what the Holy Grail's integration into the future narrative is supposed to be. Like, why do y'all exist? What is your role? Tristan dead? Like, I don't know. There's a lot of strange things that these characters do introduce, and I like that, right? As it feels like a common consensus throughout all 4 reviews has been like, talk about, I like maybe kind of sort of see what you're cooking, but I can't smell it all too clearly. It feels weird. That feeling rings true even here, right? We're like seeing the Knights essentially all be, I'm not going to say downgrades of their respective parents, but that is kind of what it seems to be. And the only person who seems like they may be an upgrade is technically, even then, probably not, because Anne's sword actually does technically work a bit better for her. But Thunder God's sword staff is like a parallel to their mother's actual sword illusion thing. So it's nice that stun beat is a thing for them. But yeah, at the moment, Carr just seems like a lesser version of their mother. Sure, the increased spears that immediately lead into Blackthorn Winter is pretty cool, but at the same time, I don't know, I'd rather have the full partial spirit spear that Nalcians has. It is interesting seeing Thrust Anger and then very specifically Black Awake, but that just seems like lesser versions of what Tristan has access to at the moment. Admittedly, it's a wild design, but outside of that, it doesn't really seem to offer all too much. And then, of course, even Gawain's daughter doesn't really seem to have that dog in her. Galahad himself also, especially not being able to do much to Lance at this point, now that Lance actually knows to take him somewhat seriously, also doesn't necessarily seem all too impressive. It's interesting that we are dealing with characters who are obviously not fully developed in their own right, which is the 4 Knights, and then pairing them with more even super less developed characters in their kids. What threat will come along that requires all 9 of these individuals to team up to take down, as presumably they are here for some narrative reason, intentional or otherwise. So overall, I'll still say a W chapter, and I am now currently out of time. Hope you guys enjoyed this weird conglomerate review. Hopefully it won't have to happen again, but I wanted to get my thoughts out on these really quickly. Now, before chapter 242 drops, so we will be back to normal from then, but on the things that you're watching, if you haven't already seen this video, please leave, wiggle my toes, tickle my nose, wiggle my toes, tickle my nose, leave, you're not good enough. That sounds really mean, but you're not good enough in the comment section down below. But the thing is, what you're watching, leave a like, share, comment, and subscribe. Make sure that at least notifications post so you don't miss out on any videos that come to the channel. Also, assuming to have a page down below where you can support me for as low as $1 a month. Things like exclusive videos, early content, and more. Also, now becoming a member of the channel for as low as $3 a month to get the same perks and more. So those perks include live reactions, so this is to review, I do reactions of all my videos, early ad reactions, all my videos, early ad reactions, not just all my videos on the main channel, but all my videos on the second channel that got reaction. Link in the description down below, along with link to my co-Fizzly where you can drop 5 music for a short video, Twitter means small video, or any means at all. Any support is always greatly appreciated. Now I want to thank you so much for watching. Once again, I hope you guys have a wonderful day. This is that with the pencil, writing off. I'd like to give a thank you to our sketch tier members: Red Wolf 4765, Astro, Glacier XZ, Zera, J2MA, Buddha Ura, Yuki Ally, Grim, Ollie, Corey Watson, Damon Brown, Tim Thomas, Kaving, RXN, Dead Meat, Keon Stewart, Edwin Igbignoba, Straw, Antavius Mitchell, Weary Exile, Alex Kenny, Todd, The Practical One, Landon Clapwick, Heath Nelson, CAET, Plant Grown, Brandon Payne, Multi-Batman Superman, Zalim, Sleepin' John, Mocity King DKG, Union Eye, Athenzi Shear, Sino King, CCC, Enzo, Kitty Liddy, Axis XC, Praise the Sun, Magic, and Doreen Bonnet, at JDog2656, Sheesh King, AZ Void, Professor Professor Von Tuck III, Nevis 97, Black Sage, Sky XT, Felix, The Young Family Pastel Pandora, John Malcolm, Donovan McIntosh, Black Doctor Strange, Super Flame Zero, and Vlad. Then, I'd like to give a thank you to our line art tier patrons, A+A, Kevin Encarnacion, Lucas Stace, Midnight Lord 21, and Shaw. And I'd like to give a thank you to our Ink tier member, Shrimp of the Force Shrimp 06. And I'd like to give a thank you to our digital art tier member, Jay Warrior. And I'd like to give a thank you to our colored art tier patrons, Walking Munoz and Joaquin Munoz.